Okay, so I waffled for a bit on how to make this video about C2 Xilonen. I was originally going to try to be like all objective, and while I think that could be helpful, it's the kind of thing that I just don't think really matters, because I can tell you that I've had Xilonen C2 for 6 months and I don't think it was worth it. That's kind of it. So first of all, this constellation is only really relevant for like a combat level, and C1 does not have a ton of combat relevance, although I will say in many ways I feel like I've actually noticed the interruption resistance value. Even though this is like an increase in interruption resistance, it's not complete interruption resistance. It's not like Zhongli shield or anything. I think I actually noticed the value of C1 Xilonen more in combat more often than I have maybe noticed C2. And generally speaking, when I have tested this in the past, like just by doing what I mentioned, like removing a main stat of whatever, it doesn't really result in meaningfully higher clear times. But I will talk about some fun stuff, because that's what I want to do. I'd rather instead of just being like, oh, C2 Xilonen is garbage, don't get it, which you probably should. I don't think it's garbage, but the weird value of this is kind of the same as like Xilonen's value in general at a baseline, where like, especially as time goes on, as they keep on releasing more and more powerful characters for more particular niches, Xilonen is a character that I don't think is going to necessarily be in a lot of characters' best teams. But she's in a situation where just the generic utility of an easy res shred buff that's just always up all the time, and, you know, various buffing artifact set options like Instructor's 4-piece Scroll and 4-piece Petra, just will keep her relevant for a large number of teams, right? It's her versatility that's the selling point. That's the same thing with her C2. It's just like, again, even more buffing versatility. Now, one thing real quick in case you didn't know, so only the characters of the elemental types of whatever they are get the buff. So only Hydro characters get the Hydro buff. If this was a situation where, you know, having a Geo unit in the party gave 50% damage bonus for everyone, or having a Pyro unit gave 45% attack for everyone, or having a Cryo unit gave 60% crit damage for everyone, this would be such a better constellation, but it's not. These abilities only trigger on the specific unit, and I always knew that when I got it originally. It's a weird constellation, but it really doesn't do a ton in practice outside of like really specific scenarios. I can tell you the Geo buff, the Pyro buff, and the Hydro buff are mostly irrelevant. I think the Geo one's kind of okay, just because like Geo units don't have necessarily the best ways of buffing themselves. There's also, of course, like the Mono Geo context, which I don't think is super relevant. Her Geo Res Shred working in Mono Geo, so that's 3 Geo unit teams, right, is good. The problem is that her burst will deal extra damage if you don't have 2 Pyro Hydro Cryos or Electros in the team, and in Mono Geo you don't, and so it does extra damage and it doesn't heal. You get no healing. This no healing when you're doing Mono Geo is still the same in C2. C2 just makes it so you get the Res Shred in Mono Geo, which is good, but I honestly think she kind of needed the healing for her to be more relevant for Mono Geo utility, so that, you know, she could be a healer for Farina. So you could do something like Ito, Farina, and like Goro, right? That could have been more relevant as like a buffing option, I think, for Mono Geo. So as it currently stands, I think the Geo sample buff is mostly relevant for Nilu, or sorry, Noelle. Noelle is just a character that already can be a healer for the team. So you can do something like Noelle, Goro, Farina, Xilonen as an alternative to like the normal like double Hydro teams, which I kind of like the idea of doing that more for, you know, Noelle DPS, just because when you're doing double Hydro with Farina and Yelan, like that team feels nice, but it feels like it's a lot more like Yelan and Farina's contribution and less Noelle's contribution. Mono Geo with C2 Xilonen and Goro will make it feel more like Noelle's contribution, if that makes sense. But that's not the same for Ito, because Ito doesn't heal, right? So you couldn't do that team without Xilonen or another healer, or I guess C6 Farina. Now the Cryo buff I think is kind of relevant, because Cryo units, they traditionally have not been, you know, the strongest. And it's worth mentioning this is just, you know, a crit damage buff for Cryo units. It's not a crit damage buff only to Cryo damage. So that means someone like Eula can actually get 60% crit damage from this buff. But Xilonen does not give any res shred to the physical damage from Eula. It's just like the crit damage buff. So ultimately, I have noticed the value of the crit damage buff for Cryo units. I really liked it with Ganyu. I made a video about that if you want to check that out. For Charlotte, I also appreciated it, because I don't know if you knew, but Charlotte does not have real multipliers to make her do good damage. She's a very, very not good DPS. I don't recommend DPS Charlotte, but when you want to just have options in your toolbox for doing something as silly as, you know, DPSing the photographer, having a C2 like this is nice. That's kind of why I wanted this constellation in the first place, is because I'm someone who plays around with a whole bunch of different teams. I value constellations on my supports more than I value constellations on DPS on fielders, because this is a tool in my toolbox to make whatever character I want stronger. Most people, though, they might be considering, oh, C2 Xilonen's HP buff, because HP buffs are really rare. So maybe you want that HP buff for a Nuvilet team. You can do Farina and Nuvilet together, and ooh, 45% HP for Farina and Nuvilet. That seems really good, right? But like realistically, for a Nuvilet team, you should probably consider Nuvilet's constellations over Xilonen C2. That's kind of how the balance works out, and that makes sense, right? Because this is a constellation that can buff multiple characters, not just one character. But Nuvilet is doing so much more of the team's damage that you should probably just get his C1 in particular, because it's such like a big buff for him, and it's also one constellation versus two constellations, yada yada. Point being, even though like the Hydro buff is rare, I don't think it's that relevant. The Pyro attack percent buff is not super relevant, because 45% attack, while not nothing for sure, is relatively quite a lot lower than what someone like Eon-san or Bennett provides, and usually you would play Pyro DPSs with one of those characters almost all the time. Sometimes both of them now. So like it's not like it's bad. It's just really not that relevant when we have other options for buffing. Like I said, I usually have not noticed the difference when I have like tried to disable it by removing attack percent from my Pyro DPS build. And now we come to the Electro buff, which is actually what I wanted to more talk about, because some people would call it her worst buff from her C2. I call it her most interesting one. I'm not going to say it's her best one, but basically this is a unique ability in that it reduces cooldown and refunds energy. But the point of the reducing cooldown, I think, is most interesting. Like, we look at Auron, right? We can reduce Auron's burst to a 9-second cooldown and give him energy, so Auron can start bursting, every like 9-10 seconds. That's kind of cool, is it not? Like, suddenly this character starts opening up different rotations. So as far as Electro units in the game, and you might have seen some like things like people playing Raiden, Chlorine, and Kaching together, and just like spamming their bursts. That's a thing you can do. I think that's a meme thing you can do. I'm going to talk about some more like actually interesting things on a team building level. Yeah, Chlorine can be reduced to a 9-second cooldown as well. Yai, interestingly, it reduces her cooldown, so you could actually like conceive of doing Yai's burst every single rotation. Normally, because of her 22-second cooldown, you wouldn't consider doing a Yai burst every rotation. So this is the kind of thing that, like, on a spreadsheet level, it doesn't necessarily result in significant damage increases, but the value of that energy and the cooldown reduction can allow you to use abilities more, and the energy potentially lets you build more crit stats on characters that have energy needs, right? And that can increase your damage. So having additional utility and abilities up at certain times can allow you to clear Abyss faster, right? So it, like, on a spreadsheet level, when you average damage out, her C2 doesn't necessarily represent a crazy DPS increase for Electro units, but in practice can change how you use units. And I think that's like a lot more compelling, and it's actually the main reason I wanted this. But I also want to emphasize, as much as I'm like kind of hyping this up, like I said in the beginning, I don't think C2 Xilonen was worth it. If I could get my wishes back, I would. I've gotten my fun out of this constellation in the last 6 months, and I'd be more than happy without it. Also, I will say real quick, her signature weapon, I think this will, generally speaking, have more an effect on most players' experience of using this character than her C2 does, because her C2 is always just situational to a particular team and character. This is just universal, just, 26% damage bonus. It's also a rare 5-star weapon that you don't have to like fully level, and it's annoying to fully level 5-star weapons because they're more expensive. They're literally 50% more expensive than 4-star weapons. It's stupid. It's very easy, even on 4-star artifacts, to max out your defense for this weapon. And by the way, you need about 3,200 defense to max out this damage bonus, which you might think, I don't have enough. But remember, the weapon gives you defense percent. And also Xilonen's own passive gives her defense percent. So you only actually need about 2,900 defense at a baseline to be able to max out this buff. It's trivially easy to build her to max out this buff. There is a loss in this weapon in that by equipping this to Xilonen, you lose access to equipping her with her other signature weapon, which is Fav Sword. Fav Sword is good because Fav is a buff for your team by giving energy. This is kind of like Xilonen C2 for Electro characters, but for all characters, right? There's this weird downside to relevant supportive weapons like Xilonen's weapon. You lose access to her other relevant supportive weapon by using this on her. I want to emphasize that. When I first got Xilonen, I kept Xilonen C0 active for I think a week or two, and I tested C0 Xilonen with her signature weapon, and then C0 as well as without her signature weapon, of course. And then I also tested C2 with and without signature weapon. And the most noticeable jump, I think, was her signature weapon. This is not me saying you should go for the signature weapon, but if you were deciding between signature weapon and C2, signature weapon is significantly cheaper, and I would probably choose this, unless you like the idea of having like the extra exploration utility, because Xilonen's a really nice exploration utility character for like climbing up walls and whatever. But if you don't care about any new characters, as always, choose to pull for new characters over, constellations and weapons. If you have any interest in new characters, particularly, as a relevant, supportive off-field damage dealer and buffer unit, maybe coming out next patch. Particularly might be relevant if you like playing cryo DPS, but that's just me making a guess. I don't know what I'm talking about. You might want to save your Primogems, is my point. But maybe you don't care, and you just want to make a character you like stronger. I would say go for the weapon banner this time over Xilonen Constellation 2. Also, maybe just don't do either. Because they're going to be power creeping at a rate that it makes it questionable to me whether or not it's worth doing high investment things, because the high investment things you do for one character will just end up being power creeped by a baseline character kit in the future, is my overall vibe right now. But maybe conversely you feel like it's worth it to do high investment things so it makes your character feel relevant longer. It's a matter of perspective. Anyways, let's go back to talking about the Electro buff. Ride-in is an interesting one. Her burst cooldown is 18 seconds, and her duration is 7 seconds, so basically you could theoretically do some much shorter rotations with Ride-in. I think with Eon-Son's release 2, right, you can take Eon-Son down to a 12-second rotation. So basically, Ride-in, now that Eon-Son exists, with C2 Xilonen, you can do 12-second Ride-in rotations. If you really like to make Ride-in stronger, you probably would get C2 Ride-in over C2 Xilonen, but I don't know, maybe you like fast rotation playstyle more. Let me know of one of my ideas here that you like the most as far as these weird short rotation things. Ride-in, I think, is one of the most interesting ones as far as short rotation utility now that Eon-Son exists. And by the way, speaking of Eon-Son, Xilonen C2 with Eon-Son, reducing her cooldown to 12 seconds, kind of addresses one of Eon-Son's main downsides over Bennett, which is notably that Bennett can have shorter rotations with some characters because Bennett has a 15-second burst cooldown. So you can do 15-second rotations with Arlecchino Bennett. You can't do 15-second rotations with Eon-Son Bennett unless you had C2 Xilonen, right? Also, Eon-Son has high energy needs, and it can help with your energy needs. Energy's valuable. Crazy. One notable thing, by the way, is as far as the energy goes, if C2 Xilonen is enabling you to do fast rotations, it's not functionally saving you that much on energy. It's just giving you the extra energy you're not going to be able to get because your rotations aren't longer. To be clear, though, there's an asterisk on that. It depends on how your character generates energy. So Eon-Son's super interesting for enabling shorter rotations, like with Raiden. Sethos, he has a burst that can be reduced to 10 seconds, which is interesting. So you could, again, another theoretical, very close to 10-second rotation unit. But again, the problem with the 10-second rotation thing is you need uptime on your other characters' abilities that line up with 10-second rotations, which is not very many abilities. So if you want to do Aggravate Sethos, for example, normally you would play with Fischl, right? But Fischl's animation times make it so I don't really necessarily know that she's going to line up very well. But you could do something like Fischl, C2 Xilonen, and Nahida, and do 10-second rotations with really good play, or slightly more than 10-second rotations. And C2 Xilonen giving energy to Sethos, because Sethos can use that energy for his charge shots, also gives weird utility for his charge attacks. So I have used C2 Xilonen to do, okay, in a funny way, it's kind of like C2 Xilonen is like having C6 Sethos without having C6 Sethos. But slightly better. One of the notable things to remember about C2 Xilonen for the Electro buff that I think many people don't realize is this can be activated every single time that you use Xilonen's skill, and her skill cooldown is 7 seconds. So in practice, you can get 25 energy and 6-second burst cooldown reduction every 8 seconds if you factor in animation time. So that means the energy value for someone like Sethos, as long as the rotations are dynamic, which he is pretty flexible, you can just spam his charge shots as long as you still have energy for it. His passive cooldown, though, of 15 seconds does limit his utility for this a little bit. I want to emphasize that. There's limitations and things you can do in the game, yada yada. These limitations are why, as much as I'm discussing all these things in theory, in practice, they sometimes don't have that much of an effect, right? And this is, again, one of the reasons that it's not really worth it. Like I said, it's fun to have in the toolbox as an option, not necessarily worth the resources. So anyways, there's interesting potential with Sethos is all it is. Fischl, same story. Fischl's long burst animation, which you can cancel out of, but it's kind of awkward in my experience. but she has potential to fit in there, and reducing her energy, making it so you can do burst every rotation, not have to do her skill is something. C2 Xilonen doesn't reduce her skill cooldown or anything, so it's kind of iffy in whether or not it actually gives you that much value for Fischl. I think she's one of the lower value units for C2 Xilonen. Beidou is kind of interesting in that it makes her fit in sub 15-second rotations, go from 20-second to 15-second rotations is interesting. Again, like having the ability to do faster rotations is a functional, meaningful DPS increase. It doesn't increase the damage numbers on screen, but it increases your, potential for clear times and adaptability. That's kind of what I focused on with my video about C2 Chongyun with Arlecchino recently. I'm pointing that out because, yeah, reducing her cooldown to have 100% burst uptime is interesting, right? Veressa you might think is an interesting utility because of Veressa's special burst, but unfortunately I don't think there's any relevance to it because Veressa's special burst of 30 energy cost is limited to being used every other plunge combo you do, so it's not really relevant. Lisa I actually think is another really interesting one because Lisa has 15% Def Shred in her kit. This functionally results in like a universal almost 10% damage increase for any form of damage dealing in the game, generally speaking. But Lisa has like really terrible, awful energy needs because of how she only generates energy on her hold skill. But C2 Xilonen giving energy and also, again, enabling a shorter rotation, so you can fit in 15-second rotations. But even in just like normal 20-second rotation context, giving the energy means you can potentially, instead of having to do, say, a Favonius build to get her energy needs, so C2 Xilonen enables a Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers build on Lisa, right? So suddenly Lisa can be buffing 48% attack, as well as her buff through the Def Shred, and, whatever value her application is from her burst, because it applies a bunch of Electro, it's doing damage. So I actually think C2 Xilonen with Lisa is one of the coolest aspects to C2 Xilonen, and if you like Lisa at all, or you just want more buffer options, more off-field utility options, it's actually kind of compelling. Unironically, I need to actually mess around more with it. The main reason I don't is because I don't really want to feature things in my videos that often that are specifically something enabled by a constellation. Lisa utility being meaningfully higher with Xilonen C2 is one of those things, I feel. So don't expect it to see it in my videos, but it is a very cool thing that I think is worth mentioning. Sara is a 20-second, down to 15 seconds. This gives potential better uptime. It's, I think, not that meaningful, ultimately. I don't know. It's not super relevant, I think, unless maybe you're DPSing Sara herself. Mostly because she already has a 10-second cooldown on her skill, so it's mostly just, solving her energy needs, which is nice, because her energy needs are annoying. Keqing, mentioned before, she can be one of the slideshow impact characters with Chlorine Raiden. Cooldown gets reduced to 6 seconds, so you can properly play C2 Xilonen and just spam Keqing's burst all the time. I tested something briefly. I have a level 70 Keqing, so I wasn't testing like the full damage potential of this, but a 4-piece Thundering Fury Keqing with C2 Xilonen can kind of just alternate to, put Nahida E on enemies, use her skill, use her burst, and you get like sub 10-second rotations functionally, just spamming a burst, and you occasionally have to swap to Nahi to put Dendro on the enemy again. It's really goofy. If you really like Keqing, honestly, I think it might be maybe worthwhile, but like, I don't know, it depends on what you like about Keqing. I don't know if you necessarily want to live in the burst animation. It's kind of just not playing the game as much when you're stuck in the burst animation. Razor, I don't think it's super relevant for, other than, I don't know, if you're really dedicated to being a Razor main and you want to have, shorter rotation potential. I don't know. Let me know if you play Razor a lot in the comments. I haven't had any ideas for C2 Xilonen and Razor, but maybe it has more potential, I think. And Dory is just another situation of, you reduce her burst cooldown, and that has some utility, but it's not insane, but it is not useless. Again, sub 15-second rotations. Basically, almost every single Electro character in the game has some theoretical potential, but their actual utility is limited not based on what just their cooldowns get reduced to, but how their cooldowns relate to other characters' cooldowns in the game. And C2 Xilonen not reducing the burst cooldown of other characters and also not reducing skill cooldown limits things a lot. Oh, I almost totally forgot. I skipped over Kuki because she was in my party already. Kuki has a 15-second burst cooldown, so it gets reduced to 10 seconds. She also, interestingly, now I don't know how many people know this, because normally you don't build Kuki for burst damage, but she has an HP scaling burst. And the 47%/82% here is because when she's under 50% HP, she does a higher multiplier damage because it just lasts longer. This is the other main video I'm tempted to make. So there's Raiden, of course, that I mentioned, short rotation, but also there's a potential playstyle of doing a 10-second rotation Kuki situation, where using a burst on Kuki every 10 seconds with 82% of her HP as damage. For reference, someone like Mualani, right, does about 100% of her HP as damage on her burst. But normally you're like bursting every other rotation on Mualani. Like Mualani's going to be a better DPS than Kuki, don't get me wrong. But I'm just mentioning this because Kuki actually has the potential to do quite significant HP scaling damage. And this also applies a bunch of Electro, so you can trigger a bunch of aggravates, and you can theoretically fit in 10-second rotations with it, but it's like in practice it's a little sus, and the reason being is because her skill, it's a 15-second cooldown. And a 15-second cooldown does not line up very well, especially with how she generates energy over the full 15 seconds. It just, like, I've tested this, it feels really weird. And like you functionally have to build a ton of extra energy on her if you want to do this playstyle. But I do want to mess around with like a 4-piece emblem playstyle with like 200 ER or something. And that seems crazy because like C2 Xilonen gets 25 energy if you're doing that every 8 seconds. She only has, you know, a 40 energy cost. You're generating so little energy in a 10-second rotation that like your energy needs are deceptively high when you're doing these hyper fast rotation shenanigans. So point being, like it's one of the cool utilities on paper where like you can suddenly turn Kuki into an HP scaling DPS. So that's why I want to mess around with this team, right? Because Nahida has her skill uptime on enemies. You have to reapply it if new enemies spawn, but it lasts 25 seconds. So that means every other 10-second rotation, you can just reapply her Dendro. You probably don't want to burst in this kind of team with Nahida because even though it's a buff, of course, the burst animation will just take too long such that you can't actually do short rotations. Sara has a 10-second skill cooldown, so theoretically can fit in 10-second rotations, right? So the idea would be, you know, do Xilonen skill every 8 seconds, do Sara skill every 10 seconds, do a Kuki burst every 10 seconds. In practice, I suspect it's probably going to be slightly more than a 10-second rotation. But in theory, this is really interesting because, you know, Sara C6 buffing crit damage, Nahida enabling aggravate, and Xilonen, you know, doing Xilonen buffing. I think that's a really cool idea, right? As far as a way to DPS Kuki. And that's not too different a situation with Raiden, like I mentioned earlier, but this is like a 12-second rotation-ish. In practice, I bet they're both going to be, you know, maybe slightly longer than that because there's rotation slop that naturally happens. And the shorter kind of rotation you're doing, the more punishing being sloppy with your rotations is. And that can happen just because you need to dodge enemy attacks or just because skill issues or whatever, right? In practice, again, this is like not that useful in my experience. It's a really fun thing to have in the toolkit for how to build teams, but it's like for the cost to get it, it's like it's expensive, right? This is equivalent for many people. You're probably considering going from C0 to C2. You probably already have wished because I'm making this a few days after the banner's live, but you know, if you're considering it right now, like versus like pulling for a Scofier or a Skirk coming out in the future, right? You can get Skirk and a Scofier for the cost of going from C0 to C2 Xilonen, right? And the situations where I feel like I've meaningfully noticed this are just quite few and far between. Xilonen is a nice and useful character without her C2. I don't think it's worth it, but let me know in the comments, because I am completely open to trying some more shenanigans in the future. Be smart with your wishes. I don't think C2 Xilonen is worth it for the vast majority of players, but maybe it is for you, and I don't know, hopefully my yap helped somewhat.